We'll take a look at some of the basic Ricardian model assumptions in this video. This will be an opportunity to introduce a number of concepts that will be used in other contexts throughout the international trade course. The Ricardian model has a very simple framework. It's basically looking at trade based on differences in labor productivity, but those differences in labor productivity really come about because of differences in technology across countries. Now we'll use the Ricardian model to introduce the production possibility frontier. We'll look at the implication of having perfect competition on the wages and prices in an economy. We'll also take a look at relative prices as well as opportunity. So let's take a look at some of the implications of individual Ricardian model assumptions. First of all, labor is the only input used in the Ricardian model production. Technology is in the background, but labor is the primary and only input that we will be taking a look at. As noted before, we will allow technology to differ across countries. That will lead to differences in labor productivity, but the basic issue is that technology is different in the two nations. We'll also have perfect competition in the product markets, that is the final output, but also in the labor market, so that lots of workers are competing with each other with lots of firms in the labor market, just as consumers and producers are acting as price takers in the output market. We'll also assume that the technology is characterized by constant returns to scale. We'll define that in just a few minutes. We'll assume that labor is mobile between sectors in the domestic economy, but we're not going to allow for immigration. That is to say, labor can't move across national borders. The amount of labor is going to be fixed by the amount available in the domestic economy. Finally, we'll assume that all labor is fully utilized by firms in the economy. That is to say that there's full employment. Now, these assumptions can be sometimes relaxed, but for now, we'll keep them applying in all the versions that we'll be taking a look at. First, let's take a look at the implications of labor as the only input. This is mainly notation. The production function, that is the thing that translates inputs into output, is very simple. ALX is the amount of labor it takes to produce 1x in country A. ALY is the number of workers it takes in country A to produce Y. The second assumption is that the production function varies across countries. BLX, the unit labor coefficient, as we call it, or the amount of workers it takes to produce X in country B, isn't the same as in country A, the same way for sector Y. Perfect competition in the product markets starts out with a familiar concept from introductory micro, that is to say price equal to marginal cost, which is an outcome when firms are price takers. They will produce up to the point where price equal to marginal cost and will not produce any more beyond that. But in the Ricardian model, we have a particular version of marginal cost. It's strictly made up of the amount that labor costs to produce 1 unit of output. In particular, the marginal cost is the wage in country A multiplied by how many laborers you have to hire in order to produce 1 more unit of this good. That is the marginal cost. That, of course, will be equal to the price in this competitive market. Now, using the notation that we've had before, ALY is the number of workers it takes to produce 1 unit of Y. WA is the wage in A, so the product of those two is the marginal cost of good Y. Of course, you have an analogous equation for good X. The price of X in A is equal to the wage in A multiplied times the unit labor coefficient, ALX, for good X. Now note that we have the same wage, WA, that apply in both sectors. That is basically a result of workers being able to move back and forth between sectors in this economy. Not only do we have, by assumption, perfect competition in the output markets, we've got perfect competition in the factor markets. In that case, the marginal cost of hiring the factor labor is equal to the marginal benefit of hiring the factor, which is the value of marginal product. The value of marginal product is the price of the good multiplied by the marginal product of labor in that sector. That tells you how much extra revenue the firm would receive if it hired one more worker given the price in the market for the final output. Now, if ALY tells you how many workers it takes to produce one unit of Y, the reciprocal, 1 over ALY, is going to give you how many extra units of output you get by hiring one more worker. Naturally, there's an analogous equation for sector X, where the price times marginal productivity of labor in that sector equals the wage. I do want to raise one cautionary note. The relationship between marginal productivity of labor and the reciprocal of the unit labor coefficients, that only applies necessarily in the Ricardian model. That will not generally be the case. We'll have constant returns to scale technology. That is to say, if you increase all inputs by some percentage point, all inputs, then output will rise by that same percentage. Of course, in the Ricardian model, that's a very simple prospect because labor is the only input. So if you increase labor, output rises by that same amount. That's another way of saying that the marginal productivity of labor in the Ricardian model stays constant. As noted before, labor is mobile across sectors, so the wage in X is equal to the wage in Y in country A. This simple presumption of wages being equalized will have important interpretations. We can set the value of marginal productivity of labor equal across sectors as well. Rearranging this equation slightly gives us a very important relationship where the price of X over the price of Y is equal to the marginal cost of X compared to the marginal cost of Y. Now, the ratio of the two prices gives us the relative price of X. And this is a very important idea. That is the price of one good compared to the price of another good. And then the relative marginal cost is going to have another important interpretation. That is going to be equal to the opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost is how much of one good you give up by producing the other good instead. That is ALX over ALY in the Ricardian model. But it does continue to be the ratio of the marginal cost in all situations. We can now turn to the production possibility frontier, or PPF. This is a representation of the supply side of the economy. It is the various combinations of output possible if all resources are used efficiently. In the Ricardian model, there's a very simple version of this because labor is the only input. Full efficient use of all resources then is simply full employment. It's the full employment condition. So let's take a look at a representation of this. Total labor supply is given by LA. That is equal to the total amount of labor used in the production of X and the total amount of labor used in the production of Y. If all labor is used in one or the other industry, the sum of those equals the total amount of labor. That is to say, you have full employment. So we'll rearrange this equation a bit. Divide everything by ALY, the unit labor coefficient for good Y. ALY cancels over on the right, and what we're left with is an equation of the unemployment rate or full employment condition, which can be interpreted as the equation for the production possibility frontier. Because it is giving the trade-offs between the production of X and the production of Y when all labor is used. And if we look at this equation, we'll see that the slope is the familiar ALX over ALY, which we've already seen is the opportunity cost of X in terms of Y that we saw earlier. So now we'll actually graph this, where the vertical axis is the amount of Y that's produced, and X is the amount of X that's produced. The most Y that can be produced is if we took all of labor in the country and divided it by how many workers it took to produce 1 unit of Y. That's LA over ALY, and that's the Y-intercept. An analogous calculation gives us the total amount of X that could be produced if you produce no Y and only X. Of course, different combinations can be produced as well, not only focusing only on one good or the other. Some combination could be produced, and that is given by this straight line, which is the PPF. As we saw before, the slope is ALX over ALY. That is to say, the opportunity cost of X is the slope of the PPF. It'll be useful to think about what would happen to this PPF if the amount of labor that was available in this economy were to double. The original PPF is given by the dotted line. If we double the amount of labor available in the economy, 2LA over ALY would be the new maximum Y that could be produced. Similarly, 2LA over ALX would be the total amount of X that could be produced if that was the only input. Connecting the two dots gives us the new PPF. And what we see is that the PPF is basically an expanded version of the original PPF. That is to say, the trade-off between the production of the two goods, the slope of the PPF doesn't change. So the opportunity cost of X and Y doesn't change in the Ricardian model if labor amounts change. That will not be the case in the neoclassical model that we'll be analyzing a bit later. A particular Ricardian model example, America has 100 units of labor. It can produce 1 unit of X with 10 workers, or it can produce 1 unit of Y with 10 workers. So the trade-off between America in X and Y is 1-to-1. Brazil takes 6 workers to produce an X, only 2 workers produce a Y. Note that by assumption, the total amount of labor that's available in the two economies are equal. So in this particular example, Brazil has the absolute advantage in good X and Y. It takes fewer resources, less labor, to produce both X and to produce Y in Brazil. America will still have a comparative advantage in one of the goods. So America's PPF, given by this line, where the intercepts are 10Y and 10X, And with a trade-off of 1y per x, that's the opportunity cost of x is 1y. And Brazil, similarly, has the ability to produce 50y with its resources, or 16.6x if it only produces x, with a trade-off, an opportunity cost of 3y for every x. Now let's take a look at the demand side of the economy. The PPF looked only at the supply side. Now we're going to be taking a look at the limits of consumption. Consumption is going to be limited by the total amount of income, the value of the production that the economy produces. So the consumption possibility frontier is going to be based on the value of domestically produced goods. We're going to take the amount that's produced and evaluate it at different prices to give the national income, the GNP. In autarky, the prices are going to be based on the purely domestic economy. How much you can afford is going to be based on what your domestic prices are. Once you open up to international trade, your consumption possibility frontier, your national income, your GNP, is going to be based on world prices, because those are the prices with which consumers and producers make decisions. So we can depict the consumption possibility frontier as related to national income, which is equal to the value of the goods that are produced, both X and Y in the economy. So that gives us the total amount of national income. And we can rearrange this in a way that's analogous to the Ricardian model unemployment or employment line, which gave us the PPF. So we can divide through by the price of Y across the equation, and then price of Y will cancel out on the right-hand side. And so what we have here is an equation that can be used to depict national income on a graph. Now, one thing in an autarky situation, the amount that you consume, XC, must be equal to the amount that's produced, XP, analogously for the Y sector. So when we have this autarky situation, we can then take a look at the national income line as representing, over on the left, the total amount of Y that could be consumed if all national income was spent on good Y. That's national income divided by PY. PX over PY, the familiar relative price, is the trade-off in consumption between buying good X or good Y. It's the relative cost, if you will, the opportunity cost in consumption. If I buy good X, I give up the opportunity to buy instead good Y. Of course, we can graph this just like we could with the employment condition. Let's assume first that 5y and 5x are produced to meet domestic consumption needs. We then evaluate that production at the prices that are relevant in the economy. A very important point to make is that this national income line is exactly the same as the PPF in autarky in this Ricardian model. What you can afford to consume in autarky is exactly equal to your production possibilities. It's the only place that you can get the goods is from a domestic source. That national income line will then be depicted, and please remember this, by a line that goes through the production point whose slope is the relative prices that are relevant in the economy.